Breaking news tonight, chaos on Capitol Hill. Pro-Trump protesters invade America's corridors of power.
Our democracy is under an unprecedented assault.
Also breaking this Wednesday night, Quebec's new crackdown. The upcoming curfew and closures as the second wave surges. Plus, the new rules about to descend on anyone flying into Canada and the lingering questions.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Robin Gill.
A dark and dangerous moment in America's modern history. Donald Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol, where lawmakers were getting ready to certify Joe Biden's election win. Instead, senators and representatives were locked down while a mob invaded. The chaos highlights how much power the outgoing president has over his followers who are trying to overthrow democracy. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. While all that was happening, President Trump stayed well hidden in the White House. Earlier at a rally today, he riled up his supporters, spewing more baseless allegations of election fraud and calling for the results to be overturned. So his defenders took matters into their own hands.
Pull them this way! Pull forward!
A crowd breached the barriers at what should have been one of the most secure places in D.C. It took more than an hour before Trump called for peace. By that point, a shot had been fired inside the Capitol building, and a warning: the footage we're about to show you is disturbing. A woman was shot while apparently trying to climb through a broken window. Metropolitan Police tell Global News she was shot in the neck and has since died from her injuries. Tonight, U.S. lawmakers are getting back down to business in the Capitol, and they're condemning the mob's actions.
Unfortunately, we can now add January 6th, 2021, to that very short list of dates in American history that will live forever in infamy. This temple to democracy was desecrated.
They tried to disrupt our democracy. They failed. They failed. They failed to attempt to obstruct the Congress. This failed insurrection only underscores how crucial the task before us is for our republic.
Our Washington Bureau Chief Jackson Proskow joins us now from D.C. Jackson, let's talk about Congress and how it's trying to repair the nation tonight.
Well, Robin, they're right back where they left off before this attempted insurrection, holding a debate at this hour over the Electoral College result in the state of Arizona. But this has essentially devolved into simply lawmakers from both sides talking about the violence at the Capitol building today. One thing you won't hear from Republicans, though, is any sort of finger pointing at President Trump or his enablers for fomenting this violence. Democrats, though, are accusing the president of fomenting this violence, and essentially that seems to be where things are now headed tonight. Now, it does seem that they will, in fact, finish counting Joe Biden's Electoral College win this evening. But it also seems many of the Republicans are now lifting their objections, the roadblocks that they had thrown up in this process, and it means it could be a much shorter debate than we were originally expecting, Robin.
When President Trump finally spoke to his followers, it was a video on Twitter. He called for calm, but did fan the conspiracy flames. Let's listen.
We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order.
Jackson, Twitter has now deleted that video and locked Trump's account for 12 hours as a result of this ongoing violent situation. But the damage is done. Will his message set the stage for a similar scene when Biden is inaugurated, which is 2 weeks from now?
The next 14 days are incredibly perilous in this country, Robin, not just here in Washington, D.C., but in cities and states right across the country. We've seen similar pro-Trump protests take place at governors' mansions and state houses across the country. Some state governors have had to move into secure locations for their own safety as a result of this. And it seems as though there could still be further attempts to try and disrupt the inauguration of Biden, especially once reality sets in for Trump and his supporters after Congress finished its work sometime overnight tonight. tonight. So there's tremendous concern about those security questions here. It also seems quite likely, though, that President Trump is going to find himself increasingly isolated during his final days in office. And what we're seeing are large numbers of members of Congress either calling for him to be impeached again, calling for the invocation of the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office, or essentially resigning from the administration. And I would not be surprised if we see a large-scale resignation from the administration, a large number of officials in various levels departing out of sheer disgust with what happened tonight. The first out the door is the spokesperson for the First Lady. So, Robin, it's already started.
Has security increased since today's developments?
Yes, the National Guard is here in Washington, D.C., state troopers, U.S. Marshals. They're all over the city. They're securing and fortifying the Capitol building so this work can continue. Of course, Robin, there's going to be lots of questions about why those measures weren't taken in advance, knowing that there was so much tension around today. But that's a question for another day at this point.
Jackson Proskow in Washington, thank you so much for today. Tonight, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau tweeted about the situation in Washington, saying Canadians are deeply disturbed and saddened by the attack on democracy in the United States, our closest ally and neighbor. Violence will never succeed in overruling the will of the people. Democracy in the U.S. must be upheld, and it will be. Voters not only sent Joe Biden to the White House, Democrats will now have control of the Senate. A hotly contested runoff election in Georgia ended with 2 Democratic senators heading to Washington. Here's how those 2 races played out. Reverend Raphael Warnock took Republican Kelly Loeffler's seat with 50.6% of the vote. And then there was an even tighter race. Democrat John Ossoff appears to have squeaked out a victory over David Perdue, ahead by less than 0.5%. These 2 wins paved the way for Biden to push forward with his vision for a post-Trump America. As Eric Sorensen explains, Georgia turning blue is seen as a clear rebuke to the way the U.S. has been governed for the past 4 years.
Well, hello, everybody.
Raphael Warnock, the first Southern black Democrat elected to the U.S. Senate ever. The pastor from the same Baptist church as Martin Luther King, his win alone is historic.
But I brought people together across racial lines, religious lines. That American promise is alive and well. After all, I'm sitting here.
But there is more history in the works. A close vote trending to a second Democrat in Georgia, John Ossoff, who's already claiming victory.
And I will look forward to serving you in the United States Senate with integrity.
The Georgia races may be squeakers, but they are potentially a culmination of a tectonic shift in power in Washington. In the November election, the Democrats in blue retained control of the House of Representatives. The Trump-Pence ticket lost, shifting the White House to the Democrats with Biden and Harris. In the Senate, the Republicans led 50-48. The 2 Georgia seats could make that 50-50, and the tiebreaker goes to the sitting vice president. And in 2 weeks, that will be Kamala Harris. She could be the 51st vote in the Senate, potentially putting the Democrats on the verge of controlling not just the Senate, but all 3 branches of government.
The hurdles before us are many, and they are serious.
A capital long dominated by the power of Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is suddenly within the grasp of Democrat Chuck Schumer.
For too long, much-needed help has been stalled or diluted by a Republican-led Senate and President Trump. That will change.
With control of the Senate, President Joe Biden will have a clearer path for a progressive agenda.
These Senate seats are truly the last line of defense.
President Trump's claims of voter fraud likely suppressed the Republican vote in Georgia, further dividing his own party.
I think a lot of it will get blamed on Donald Trump. We're seeing really a split now in the Republican Party. We'll see just how deep it goes between those who stay loyal to Trump and those who just want to put him in the past as quickly as possible.
The president's desperation to stay in the White House may have cost Republicans the Senate, and Donald Trump may have diminished his party and his presidency on his way out the door. Eric Sorensen, Global News.
Now to some breaking news here in Canada. After weeks of surging coronavirus case numbers, Quebec is imposing a strict province-wide curfew. This is the province's trajectory. It's been 12 days since tough measures took effect, and case numbers are still surging. Today, there were more than 2,600 new infections, and 47 more people died. Quebec Premier François Legault says the situation is now critical, and he has no option but to impose even stricter measures to get the crisis under control. Global's Mike Armstrong is in Montreal tonight. Mike, take us through these measures, starting with the curfew.
Sure, that is the big thing that's being announced tonight, that curfew. The new rules will come into effect this coming Saturday, this weekend. The big one, that curfew, it'll be for 4 weeks, basically from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. Aside from going outside for work or for health reasons overnight, people can't be outside. That'll go until the 8th of February. There is a hammer to this measure. People can be fined for not respecting the curfew, $1,000 to $6,000. Other measures in this sort of enhanced lockdown being announced. Non-essential stores closed already since December 25th will stay closed also until February 8th. Grocery stores and convenience stores are being asked to close at 7:30 so people can get home for that curfew. Only gas stations and pharmacies are allowed to stay open. Now, as for schools, that's been a big one for parents. Closed since December 17th. Well, elementary schools will reopen as scheduled Monday. High schools won't be reopening right away. They're going to do an extra week of online classes. Now, why all these measures? The Premier says this is a race against time. The virus is moving too quickly. He has to slow it down to save the healthcare system, he says, and that's going to take what he calls shock therapy. Robin?
Mike Armstrong in Montreal. Thanks, Mike. For the second day in a row, New Brunswick has broken its record for daily new infections. 31 new cases were reported today. That brings the total number of active cases to 110. Just 1 week ago, there were only 28 active infections in New Brunswick. The province's top doctor says holiday gatherings are to blame. She's warning the province to brace for more.
As grim as it looks today, things will likely get worse before they get better. Everyone must act now to follow public health guidance and advice. The alternative is even stricter public health measures to counter the spread of this disease.
All of New Brunswick is now in the orange phase of restrictions. People are being asked to stick to a one-household bubble. Face masks are mandatory in all indoor public spaces. As of midnight tonight, anyone coming into Canada from abroad will have to show proof of a negative COVID-19 test. The federal government rushed in the new requirement, and that has the industry scrambling. As Abigail Beeman reports, the big concern is how the new rule will be enforced.
Thailand wants tourists to come back, so off we go.
These Canadians hitting the skies are aware of the new rules. They'll need a negative PCR test within 72 hours of their flight home.
I agree with the policy. We have people who have canceled, and we also have people in destination right now.
While this travel agent's business is down 90%, there are still many Canadians in destination around the world left scrambling.
8 to 9 hours on the phone calling several hospitals, civic centers, urgent care centers, private practitioners, just to try and get this test.
Brutal. I mean, it's absolutely ruined this vacation. I've spent the last 3 days trying to figure out how to get a COVID test. I don't know if I'm going to get shoved into some detention center.
I am getting tested twice next Wednesday in the hopes that somebody will succeed.
Wednesday, the federal government announced people like Arthur Mitchell in Mexico and Canadians in locations including the Caribbean, South America, and Ethiopia can provide a test from within 96 hours. But that exception only lasts until next week, with some further limited exceptions for Haiti and the French islands off Newfoundland and Labrador.
The consulate wasn't answering COVID-related calls.
The extensions don't help many in the United States, told test results take up to 7 days, like Harpreet Singh Maan trying to return to Canada for childcare help.
It just seems like a complete mess the way they've rolled these rules out. There was no thought put into it.
This is exactly why we're advising people to not travel internationally. It is difficult to acquire a PCR test in countries that you wouldn't suspect that it's difficult to acquire one.
The airline industry responsible for checking tests at boarding has been calling for more time.
We are going to now have to deny those people boarding and their return flights to Canada. So we are still concerned about the potential for confusion and the potential of stranding people in foreign countries because they have not been able to meet their requirements at this point.
Along with the new test requirements also comes an end to the ban on flights from the UK. But Ottawa is clear, a negative test does not replace a 14-day quarantine. Anyone entering Canada still needs to follow those rules. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
Another day, Another apology for a tropical vacation. Coming up this time, it's a doctor and a hospital CEO. A hospital CEO in Ontario is facing fallout for a trip he took over the holidays. Dr. Tom Stewart, who sat on a provincial COVID-19 advisory panel, went on vacation to the Dominican Republic, despite public health advice not to travel. Stewart has since apologized and resigned from several advisory groups. But as Mike Drolet reports, that hasn't quelled frustrations in a province struggling with the pandemic.
The new year is usually full of hope, and empty streets in Toronto would seem to suggest the current COVID-19 lockdown is being adhered to.
Name and date of birth.
Premier Doug Ford has tough decisions to make, but he'll have one less expert to call on. Dr. Tom Stewart, who makes $650,000 as a CEO of Niagara's hospital system, resigned as an advisor to Ford after it came to light he had traveled to the Dominican Republic after Ford urged Ontarians to stay home. He has since apologized and deleted tweets where he was critical of Ontarians' reckless and selfish behavior, and in another, a lack of provincial leadership. The head of Ontario's hospital union says the 13,000 physicians and staff who work for Dr. Stewart are overworked and now unhappy.
You know, there's a set of rules for them, which is weekends are canceled, vacations are canceled, holidays are canceled. And, you know, one of the people who's leading them in this battle is not actually in the battle at all, but is off.
For all Ford's problems with the pandemic, he can't shake questions about the issue of leadership and privilege, and he refused to give a straight answer about others who may have ignored the rules.
I made it very clear to everyone not to travel, and I made it very clear to our caucus and cabinet.
In effect, by not responding, it's an admission. And more is going to come out, and it's going to hurt them more.
And that's not good considering the state of the province. Epidemiologists warn of more record-breaking days ahead as the COVID-19 positivity rate, which is hovering around 9%, continues to rise. The lockdown was supposed to ease the burden on hospitals, but ICU cases are now so high, elective surgeries are being cancelled. In Burlington, a field hospital built in April hadn't been needed until now, and morgues in London and Windsor are over capacity. A political controversy is the last thing Ford needs. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
Still ahead, Alberta's premier is MIA as outrage builds over government travel. Alberta's Premier Jason Kenney is still nowhere to be seen after the travel scandal involving 6 of his MLAs and his now former chief of staff. 2 of Kenney's cabinet members have apologized on behalf of the provincial government. But now Calgary's mayor, one of the premier's toughest critics, revealed members of his staff traveled over Christmas too. Heather Yerkes-West reports.
It was the apology that Albertans had been waiting for, but it did not come from the premier.
If you're yelling at us, interestingly enough, my message is thank you. That there is no doubt in our mind we didn't get it right.
It was left to Rick McIver, an Alberta cabinet minister now in charge of 2 portfolios, after Tracy Allard was booted out of the inner circle for a trip to Hawaii. She was demoted along with 5 other MLAs for spending Christmas abroad. Outside of social media posts, Jason Kenney has not spoken publicly since New Year's Day, and his absence has been noticed.
I just don't know how you can recover from something like this. It would be different if it were, sort of a blip in an otherwise relatively successful government, one that had sort of momentum on its side. But the momentum has been going the other direction for months now.
But if Kenney is in hot water, he's no longer on his own.
2 members of my staff, including my chief of staff and an administrative assistant in my office, traveled over the Christmas break.
Calgary's mayor's first response was to defend his staff.
They're not politicians. And so ultimately, I have decided that I will not take any further action on this.
Incensed, a group in Calgary is now circulating a petition calling on the city to lift COVID restrictions. If Mayor Nenshi thinks it's fine for his chief of staff to shop at small businesses in Maui, maybe it's time to lift the restrictions on small businesses in Calgary. As for the premier, he'll have to face the voters eventually because current health measures expire soon.
He has to address the public
before January the 12th. If he's going to allow for more freedom, he's got to explain why now is the right time. And if he's going to allow for the lockdown to continue, he's got to justify that too.
Along with his reasons for being absent for this long. Heather Yurex, West Global News, Calgary.
Up next, America's capital under a curfew after a day of chaos. Back to tonight's top story, the chaos in the U.S. Capitol. Protesters loyal to President Donald Trump stormed the Capitol building to try to stop Congress from confirming Joe Biden's victory. And tonight, the American Capitol is under a curfew. President Trump did release a statement telling protesters to go home, but he also repeated the lie that the election was stolen from him. Our Washington Bureau Chief Jackson Proskow once again joins us this evening. Jackson, this is really just unbelievable, but should we be surprised by what unfolded in D.C. today?
Absolutely not, Robin. You know, just 45 minutes before the siege of the Capitol, Rudy Giuliani was on a stage outside the White House at President Trump's rally, calling for trial by combat. And this is the type of rhetoric that has been coming from the president and his closest allies and his enablers ever since he lost the election. They have made it clear that they feel the election was stolen. They have leveled these baseless accusations, all in an attempt to ramp up Trump's supporters. And you know that some people are simply going to move on when they realize that Trump has lost. You also know that there are people who are not going to move on from that and take this as literal incitement, and that's what we saw today. The other thing here, Robin, is that the security at the Capitol complex is going to face intense scrutiny. In this city, for big events like a State of the Union address, that place is a fortress. There's a non-scalable fence that is erected around the Capitol complex for blocks. The National Guard is here. There are specialized military units that secure the building. Yet despite all the fears, despite all the threats of violence for today's joint session of Congress, none of that was in place. None of it. All we saw were Capitol Police defending the building and low crowd control barriers. And that tells you that there was simply not enough security in place for something that was destined to become violent based on the rhetoric we've heard over the past little while.
All right, Jackson Proskow in Washington, thank you so much for today. And that is Global National for this Wednesday night, a historic day in Washington. I'm Robin Gill. Thank you for watching.